So I'm gonna throw this open. Just to stress, in case it's unclear, we are, although our entry point for quite a lot of this discussion is UK policy, we're not concerned exclusively here with UK policy on stabilisation, and nor are we concerned just, for example, with Afghanistan. It strikes me that there is probably a difference between those contexts where you, the would-be stabiliser, are present as a belligerent force, and where you, and that might be true of Afghanistan, it could be the UN in DRC, and where you are present in a different capacity. So I am going to throw this open for questions, comments. Please, if you would, say who you are and what your affiliation is. And there is a microphone for you to talk into. So, anyone would like to kick this off? Please.
Hi, my name's Matt Freer. I work for a company called Albany Associates. Just picking up sort of one of the themes that a few of you mentioned about this sort of skewing of aid to parts of a country that are the conflict-ridden areas. How much does that matter? This is really for all the talkers. How much does that matter, and how much, what can we do about it? Because it's the ultimate difficult question. Do you reward conflict or do you reward peace?
Thank you. I'm going to take, if there are other questions, just 2 or 3, I think, together. So please, yes, at the back.
Hi, my name's Emma Shoemaker. I work with a company called iMedia Associates, and we do quite a lot of work in Afghanistan, actually, around stabilisation work, particularly communications. And what struck me in much of what was talked about was the importance of effective governance, supporting this bargain between elites, the importance of bottom-up processes, voice and accountability, and so on. And all of these are very much communication processes. In terms of the media, obviously has to play a role. The debate between populations about which government they're going to support or which elites they're going to support or engage with, and the accountability of those elites and the bargains that are struck. So I wonder what role panel members might see communication playing in these strategies themselves. They're obviously implicit in many ways, but how can they be made more explicit? And if there is a role for them in these strategies, where does that fit in terms of particularly SU's capability? We know that strategic communications is part of what SU does, but it's not the largest part of their mandate by any means.
Thank you. Please.
Hi, Richard Brown, PRD York. I just want to follow on from Matt's point, if I may, because I think my question relates to that. Targeted and untargeted aid, I just wonder whether if we could look at untargeted aid on a national basis where there are conflict and non-conflict areas, that might, on a bigger proportion basis, might actually help solve the problem. An example, of course, would be the National Solidarity Programme in Afghanistan, which is supposed to be across nationwide and based on populations, not on so much on what they perceive they need, not what we perceive they need. And perhaps if those programs were able to be spread more uniformly between conflict and non-conflict areas, would that be a partial solution to the skewed aid issue? Thanks.
Thank you. Why don't we, do you want to squeeze in a related question? Or? Yeah, okay. No, please do.
Jean-Michel Gant from Action Against Hunger, just a quick question. Could you, it seems a very appealing concept, and we have seen that there is quite a lot of potential constraint. Could you give us just, to use the rhetoric of the new government, an example of success? Because for the moment we are all looking for evidence of success to roll out this stabilisation unit, and so I would very appreciate of size example of success. My second question is that I'm not a specialist of the DFID history, but I have the impression that years ago it was decided to create DFID and to separate it from the Foreign Office as a separate and independent entity. Is there any risk that with this new concept of national security we had, again, a loss of independence of a DFID and a loss of this key principle of having poverty and being needs-based driven agenda as its core principle. Thanks.
Thank you, Jean-Michel. So, panel, who would like to kick off? Sheelagh, would you like to?
Do you think you could just get that picture of the shore up? As do you mind? Just that, if you go right through. Not that, the one, not that one. Next one. That one. Yeah. Thanks very much. Yeah. Let me pick up on a few of these themes. And just to start, I think with one of your really important points, this point about voice, and I think that's critical actually, and I think it might well be worth explaining that as a separate line of activity rather than the four that we just have. But we do see a key part of the security agenda, the establishing the secure space as about giving people a chance to speak and to kind of come and complain, and then that goes to your question about successes. I mean, I would give you as a very specific example, but I'll just make it wider, which is, this is a whole group of people, and this is just the middle part of the tent, and it was packed, basically coming to complain about the fact that both government and the donors hadn't delivered what they promised to deliver. So I could talk about things like welfare delivery or things like that, but from my perspective, as someone who's worked for many, many years on governance, the big sign of success is that you've opened up, and I hate to use the word democratic in this kind of context because it's been so badly used, the word democracy and democratic in this kind of context. But what you have effectively opened up is a space where people can gather and they can come and complain. Now, what I have said that I'm concerned about is there are no women coming to complain in this kind of context, and that's not cracked yet. But I don't. I'm very interested in the Yemenings of it. I don't think anybody's really cracked that yet, and I hope we'll be working forward on that. And what is that? The basis of this is not us actually, as a stabilisation community or even as an international community, but starting with Governor Mangle, who took over the governorship of Southern Helmand, and then his gradual. The fact that he was supported by the people, so he was kept in place in spite of quite a lot of opposition from other parts of the Afghan government. He was kept in place because people wanted him there and respected him as an honest administrator. And he then appointed both into the police service and into the sort of district governorates a whole set of other competent and honest administrators. For example, Habibullah in Nadi Ali. Now, we can't claim direct credit for that, but there is a space within which people are asserting what they want, rather than just having to do what central government wants and just having to accept dishonest bureaucrats. So I wouldn't call that a success that we, the UK, have delivered, but I would say we have been part of what it has taken for Governor Mangle to be able to deliver that sort of success across Southern Helmand. So that's just to kind of pick up on those two things. To pick up on a couple of these other things, I think one of the things to say about Afghanistan is that Afghanistan at the end of the Soviet occupation was one of the most under-aided countries in the world, and it's now one of the most over-aided countries in the world. And I think the key thing is to stop that kind of pattern from happening. So I'm probably not arguing with your specific figures, but what I am saying is that there's a relationship between the volatility of aid and conflict. So one of the development argument, I think, is that we need to make sure that aid is not volatile and that it is better focused on more marginalised areas that have the potential to fall into conflict. But your sort of the top parts of Afghanistan that you're talking about that are not Southern Helmand but that are still potentially conflicted are important in that regard. And just in terms of what DFID does, it does have a national programme. And that national programme is ring-fenced. It is not getting sucked into Helmand because of the way that the conflict pool works. So that national programme continues to operate across Afghanistan. And that is a function of, as you were saying earlier, the fact that the poverty agenda still remains at the top of government's agenda. So not a complete answer, but a partial answer. I don't know if there's anything else I should pick up on, but let me stop there and pass on for now.
Thank you. Good. Who'd like to connect?
Go ahead, Stuart.
Thank you, I think. Okay. I wanted to pick up on Matt's
point first of all, the skewing of aid towards conflict-affected areas. I think too much aid in an environment that can't absorb it creates tremendous problems. And what we've created in Afghanistan is the world's largest rentier state, possibly the largest in history. And it's created tremendous pressures in terms of elite empowerment, corruption, which has really undermined other aspects of the stabilisation strategy to develop community voice and accountability of government to that community voice. So I think there are real risks to stabilisation strategies of aid being distorted and creating these rather negative unintended consequences. In terms of community voice and accountability, I think it's fair to say that we've got a little bit of a leap of faith over community voice and accountability. The idea that by building the awareness of rights amongst rights holders and strengthening the capacity of government to be responsive as a duty bearer, we think that by doing these two sides of the equation, that will automatically translate into changes of behaviour and power relations. And that's become a key concept within the stabilisation literature. And I think it poses real problems that the power relations are incredibly enduring, and therefore community voice may increase, expectations may increase, but delivery may in fact go down. So we have a potential weakness in the model. The second problem with it is where it has worked, and I think Richard's point about the National Solidarity Programme providing a useful model is absolutely spot on. Where it has worked, the benefits have been reasonably significant, and it does provide us with a useful model. But the creation of these community voice and accountability structures is incredibly difficult to scale up in most conflict environments. And Afghanistan with the NSP is perhaps an unusual set of circumstances. So expecting to be able to replicate something like NSP in all conflict environments, scaling it up to create a stabilisation effect is going to be extremely difficult. And the third point is about the National Security Committee. What I'm slightly concerned about is that what it creates is an almost isolated DFID advocating furiously on behalf of poverty reduction and MDGs, with other government departments that are pushing firmly in the direction of a security focus. And I think that is of concern. I don't know if anybody else wants to pick up on that point.
I mean, if I could just make a comment on that. The key thing to maintain in this situation is that poverty reduction is seen as an end in its own right. Not always conflated, and hence the need to be clear about the difference between the relationship between poverty and conflict and the relationship between exclusion and conflict. So that's the kind of key thing there. Now, at the moment, that has stayed. That is still there. Poverty reduction remains a key foreign policy objective.
Can I perhaps come on the communications point, because I think you raise, I completely agree that the role of communication processes are really critical. What you can and can't use in different, because we put all these states in one basket, of course, and they are so diverse in themselves, and the freer the press, the higher role of the media. But I mean, something that I think for example, that we did was simply print the OCHA humanitarian maps, where this is in OPTI, where you can see the green line, you can see where the wall is going. We simply printed them in Israeli newspapers, and there is such a lack of any kind of information in Israel about what is actually happening. This was quite revolutionary. So using all manner of communications to try and build awareness of one side versus the other, or the realities of the situation for people, I think is really critical. But just coming back to this point about voice, I think whilst you can take a sort of theoretical, yes, well, what's the sort of result of it? I guess from a very practical point of view, though, Stuart, the thing that happens with a lot of people in conflicts, and particularly women, is that you lose any sense of self-esteem, self-confidence, and actually enabling people to regain a little bit of sense of control over their own destiny through some activity that gives them a voice is incredibly powerful and incredibly necessary in a lot of these places. So I wouldn't underplay its importance. And I guess finally, on that sort of link between poverty and inequality, yes, of course they're different things, but sadly, I think they are inextricably mixed. So sorting out what you are actually, what your theory of change is, you need to understand both inequality and poverty, Sheelagh, in a way that allows you to come up with quite sophisticated strategies, because one can't be addressed without the other. They are, as long-term development practitioners, we've sort of, you and I have known that for a long time, kind of thing as well. And just, if I can, James, the sort of final point around, you've mentioned that magic word, democracy. What I hear people asking for is not democracy. It's about rule of law. It's about justice. And it's about inclusivity, not necessarily about democracy. And I think it's really unhelpful to use those terms, actually. But certainly rule of law, and certainly, where's my voice? Can I participate? What's my role, certainly.
Very good. Thank you. I'm going to take another round of questions. I'm first going to ask Liam if he's got any questions from people who are following us online.
Thanks, James. We got one question from Nicholas Meller. He says, there seems to be a tension between stabilisation, which implies power over a situation, and the active citizenship that Penny mentioned. Certainly, the tension in Afghanistan is the sense that local empowerment is eclipsed by central government seeking to exert power, and they in turn are eclipsed by international agencies. To what extent is local voice actually measured as an outcome of the stabilisation programme, and how important is this compared to other outcomes that are measured?
Interesting question. Let's keep that on the list. I'm going to ask. I have a question myself, but I'm going to ask first of all if anybody else on the floor would like to come in at this point, please.
Robert Grant, Wilton Park.
Can I ask you if you don't mind speaking to the microphone, because we're going to record.
Robert Grant, Wilton Park. I'd like to follow up on your question, James, about whether if donors are in environments where they're not perceived to be belligerents, how does it change the nature of the discussion we've just been having? And I'd like to go further along that line and ask, how does it change the nature of the discussion if donors are supporting a belligerent party in a conflict state, but not through boots on the ground? They're supporting the belligerent in other ways. For example, the United States in Colombia, other countries in the Philippines, as well as the United States, and there are quite a few other examples of that. And finally, again, a slight rephrasing of your question. Is it possible to deliver development assistance in a conflict environment without being perceived as at least supporting a belligerent, if not actually being, one of the belligerents yourselves? I think, unless your development and state building objectives are effectively integrated with a peace building strategy, it seems to me you're inevitably going to be perceived as a belligerent. And I know, of course, it's now major goal of DFID and other development agencies to integrate state building and peace building strategies, but there's a lot of tension between those, and it's very complex and much easier said than done, and could be very prone to failure. And so anyway, those are just some additional dimensions to throw out.
Thank you for that. Samir?
Thanks. Samir Hawari from ODI. I guess I have a question for Sheelagh. I think it's quite welcome that you try to nuance the conflict development relationship, and then you kind of mentioned the issue of exclusion and the importance of focusing on exclusion. And I guess my question is, how do you reconcile that focus with on inclusion? when I guess stabilisation sometimes has an underlying logic of exclusion, particularly with groups that are deemed to be spoilers. So that sometimes that could be a government such as Hamas and OPT, it could be a belligerent such as the Taliban, but sometimes it can also be members of civil society such as trade union movements in Colombia. So I was wondering how you can reconcile this fact that you need to tackle exclusion, but at the same time stabilisation can actually reinforce types of exclusion.
Interesting question, and if I may abuse my position as chair, I had a related question to that and to yours indeed, Robert, which is, are there different models of stabilisation here that indeed may not necessarily be premised on exclusive support to the incumbent regime? I'm actually thinking of Nepal at the moment. I'm thinking of the steps that DFID and other donors took to engage with the Maoists at a time when that became politically possible. And indeed it involved to some extent bypassing the central authorities. This admittedly was after the king had staged a coup, so the legitimacy of the central authority was dubious to say the least. But in a way it seemed to me to be part of what you might call a stabilisation model. In other words, what are the different models, and would that come under a stabilisation rubric? Perhaps we could take that sort of cluster of questions.
Okay, do you mind just repeating the first one? I know it was a long question, but I didn't quite capture it. Capture it all.
There seems to be a tension between stabilisation, which implies power over a situation, and the active citizenship that Penny mentioned.
Yeah.
Certainly the tension in Afghanistan is the sense that local empowerment is eclipsed by central government seeking to exert power, and they in turn are eclipsed by international agencies.
Yeah.
To what extent is local voice actually measured as an outcome of the stabilisation programme, and how important is this compared to other outcomes that are measured?
Okay. All right. I mean, on that one, we do we use Sheelagh attendance as a sort of a proxy measure, and we also do quite a lot of independence research, some of which is just reporting now on random research, random samples of people, and we kind of compare what they want with what they're getting and their perceptions of what they're getting. So we do attempt to measure engagement, and I think there is always a tension between state power and active citizenship, but it's exacerbated in this kind of context where there's so much overt violence in the environment. I think what we try and do within a stabilisation context is, hence the focus on security, ensure that there is as enough general and kind of security for people to move around and engage as is possible, so that there is, as far as possible, the space within which people can engage and participate. Now again, I hesitate to call that democracy. Penny doesn't like the term democracy, but that is the point about trying to set up those kind of secure spaces and enable shorers that people can attend. And one of the things that we have observed is that when things are safer, two things start to happen. One, people start to get out and go to the markets and visit the health clinic and that kind of thing. And two, they start to go to shorers. So as soon as the space is safer, people are starting to kind of exercise, they're starting to have agency, and they're starting to exercise choice over what they do. So that's that question about the tension, and do we measure it? Yes, we do try and measure it. Do we always deliver it? Not sure. I think so. I mean, and I think my observation about Helmand is that it's getting better. So as the safety zone expands, there is more people are going to the market, more people are going to shorers, more people are saying what they want. Different models of stabilisation, not premised on support to the incumbent regime. I would argue that none of them are premised on support to the incumbent regime per se, hence the emphasis on elections. So again, I think ultimately you're trying to enable enough safe space that people can vote in. And one of the things that happened in Southern Helmand over the last election is that there was and Lindy Cameron spoke about this on Women's Hour the other day, but there was a big celebration in Lashkargah, where what was recognised that there had been no shooting within 6 miles of the district centre, and that was seen as a sort of a major advance. So in other words, people did feel reasonably safe to kind of come out and vote. Now, of course, elections, as we've seen from Zimbabwe, elections can be fixed. They don't always deliver. They're not always the answer. But again, the point is that I think at the end of the day, what happens in safe spaces is people start to exercise their choices, both at local government level. They start to participate more. In theory, as spaces become safer, there should be more local organising, more space for local NGOs, and people should be able to kind of vote and start to kind of exercise a view. So I don't think that stabilisation is necessarily about support to an existing regime, and I would agree that the Maoist situation is a good example of what can happen, and it's certainly true that there is a big emphasis on reconciliation and participation in overall policy on Afghanistan.
And that, so if I understand you, I mean, even after Karzai had been legitimately elected, the emphasis remains on support to state institutions as opposed to a particular governmental regime. Is that what you're saying? Is that the distinction we're making?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. So,
Thank you,
and
Sheelagh.
particularly state institutions, as I say, that are focused on voice, to use your term, although.
Who else would like a go at this?
Just a quick one, really. On the question, I think from Nicholas, the measures of community voice and accountability. I think one of the problems with this is that we haven't really got systematic measures for proving that sort of miracle between a community's awareness of its rights and the power holders' awareness of its duties, and how these are kept in balance, how awareness of rights don't exceed the capacity of the state to deliver against them in an inherently destabilising way. We haven't really got measures of how the power relationships will change. What we have are a series of proxy measures that don't really capture the dynamics of this miracle in this middle space, and I think that's an area for significant research, I think, in the stabilisation models. The second point, I think, is just a quick one about the idea of a universal stabilisation model. I think the British approach, which is pragmatic and flexible, very much the British way, is probably about right in lots of ways, despite creating the problems that I described. The level of support that you can give to a government that may or may not be toxic, the level of support that you can give to local structures which may be toxic in their own right, the need to bypass or work through institutions of the state, the need to link in with the United Nations or the United States and strategies that they have, make the creation of a sort of universal one-size-fits-all model almost impossible on both the supply side and on the demand side. I think all that can be done in terms of a universal model, which sort of touches on both Samir and Robert's point, is to start looking at priorities which are potentially common, and they will be the creation of a local and national political settlement. They will be the creation of a security situation that's able to allow some of the core institutions of that society to function. But to turn this into a sort of precise list of 400 steps that you will deliver in a stabilisation and conflict environment, I think is always going to be impossible.
Thanks, Stuart. Penny.
I guess just a lot of that I would agree with, but actually more articulation, more reflection and more articulation of what doesn't work, and more honesty of assessment of what doesn't work, I think is needed by all of us. And I think through that kind of dialogue and that more open sharing, then there is a lot that we can learn, because certainly in all of these situations, we need to also be brave. And if you're going to be anxious about, that might cause, real difficulties in terms of reputational risk, rather than focusing on actually that might just lead to a bit of a breakthrough, then you really want to encourage people to go for those breakthroughs where you think they can. So I guess there's a danger in not being reflective practitioners, I guess, in this area, of not being sufficiently brave either. So cautioning against that too.
If I may, I'm just going to, just before we wrap up, I'm just going to push you all a little bit more on Samir's point, because I don't think we've really answered it. I think that his question was about, there's a logic of exclusion often, it appears, in our engagement in these contexts. You know, we'll talk to anybody as long as they're not Hamas or the Taliban or the Tigers or whoever it is. They're all on terrorist lists. And, you know, the States these days, you can get arrested for dealing with them under the Patriot Act, and I guess in a number of other places too. And yet we know the logic of long-term settlement is somehow there has to be an inclusive settlement that somehow has to represent those interests and the people those constituencies represent, the constituencies these parties represent. How does this fit together? How does it add up? I'm not sure I understand this either. The Maoist case, by the way, is an interesting counter-example of that. We went from a point of seeing the Maoists as the problem, and essentially a policing problem, to a necessary part of the solution, but only because a kind of political window opened that let us. But in these other contexts, it's not even on the agenda. So how do we square this? Do you want to have a...
Well, I mean, it is on the agenda, quite clearly. You know, the reconciliation thing has been on the agenda for, upwards of a year now. It's quite clearly there as a sort of central function of government policy. And that's right at the top, and it's at sort of every level we work at.
In Afghanistan specifically?
No, I'm answering the question about Afghanistan. I think in Pakistan as well, the answer would be in the affirmative, and it's certainly in the Sudan, the sort of need to incorporate everybody at the table is clearly there. And most of the countries that we function in and we deliver on this kind of thing, it's quite clear both as a matter of policy and as a matter of principle that it's not possible without at least considering reconciliation at some point in the process.
Stuart.
I just wanted to add one thing. I think it may be worth drawing a distinction between reconciliation and reintegration. And I would argue that stabilisation tends to be at a lower level in many ways, whereas grand political bargains about reconciling former belligerents tend to be at a much more strategic political level. Whereas the stabilisation practitioner is probably concerned about a marginalised community that might be considered to be the floating voter, that may or may not supply tacit or other forms of support to an insurgency or a paramilitary group. And reintegration poses a different set of challenges from reconciliation and the grand political bargain that espouses. So I wonder if that might be a way of perhaps drawing a distinction between the political and the social.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a really important point, actually. And I think it's linked to, reconciliation tends to be linked to short-termism and short-term interventions. And this needs to be, you know, the long-term, we're in it for the long game and in it for the sort of long-term analysis, which reintegration, I think, helps link to, I think is a really important point to end on. But it would also be a real worry about the stabilisation units, you know, that long-term, in it for the long-term question mark, I guess.
Okay, can I just make, because that was said earlier, and I mean, I think, again, being in there for a long term is now quite clearly a matter of policy. And, you know, Petraeus sort of encapsulated when he said that he wanted Afghanistan to stand up but not stand alone. And it's quite clear that there is a long-term engagement in Afghanistan that will go beyond the end of this phase and hopefully this conflict, which we hope will end soon.
Very good. Thank you. It's 2:30. I think we should wrap this up. So I would like to thank you all for coming. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'd like to thank our panel very much for leading a very interesting discussion.
Thank you.